Hey, this is Matt from Never Not Making, and this is just a quick video to show you how I make these chaos boxes. They're made of multiple species of woods, and they're a lot easier to make than you might think, and they're big sellers at craft shows. Check it out. The first thing I did was to break out the old scrap wood bin to see what kind of hardwood scraps I had laying around. For this batch of boxes, I used a combination of walnut, padauk, maple, cherry, meranti, and white oak. After getting all my scraps together, I laid them out on the workbench to determine how I wanted to arrange the pieces. There's not really any rules to the layout. You can use a symmetrical approach like I ultimately did, or something more random like I'm showing here. The main thing to be aware of is grain direction. If you keep all the grain running in the same direction, you shouldn't have any issues with your glue seams splitting. At this point, I'm basically making a bunch of long, narrow cutting boards. I glued up all the strips, clamped them together, and allowed them to dry overnight. Then I came back and ran all the glue ups through the planer until they were all a consistent thickness that was somewhere around 3/4 of an inch. I then moved over to the crosscut sled on my table saw. I made a mark on the sled about 1 inch from the curve of the blade and proceeded to cut all of my stock into smaller pieces. Again, if you want to add a little more character to your boxes, feel free to cut these at random widths. You can also opt to cross-cut at an angle and then stagger your pieces like this example here. Just keep in mind that clamping angled cuts can be quite tricky. The next step was to once again arrange my pieces, apply a liberal amount of glue, clamp them, and let them set overnight. Then it's back to the planer for the final time to mill all of my scrap wood slabs to the same thickness, this time around 1/2 inch. Again, I can't stress the importance of keeping your grain running in the same direction. If you rotate your pieces and try to run end grain through the planer, you run the risk of chip out or even having your workpieces break apart, which can cause damage to your equipment or even injury. Once everything was milled down, I then proceeded to clean up the edges with the table saw. It's important to true up the sides of these as best as possible in order for your box to come out square. While I'm over here, let's talk about the other cuts that I'm going to make. So here's my workpiece. I'm going to set my table saw fence about 3/4 of an inch away from the blade and run a dado to the length of the piece. I will then move the fence out about 1/8 inch and make the next cut. I'll keep repeating this until I have a 1/4 inch wide dado that will be used to hold the bottom of the box in place. I will then determine my box dimensions based on the length of the stock and mark where my miters will be cut. You will see that all the miters are cut on one side, which will ensure that the pattern on the outside of the box lines up. Normally I would make these cuts using my table saw sled, but I was itching to try out my recently purchased radial arm death machine. Then it was time to gather up all of my pieces, glue the mitered edges, and fit the box bottoms into the dados. Painter's tape does a good job of temporarily holding the boxes together until a steel hose clamp can pull everything tight. Now that I have my assembled boxes, I give them a once-over with an orbital sander, and then it's on to making the lids. The lids are going to be made out of this 3/4 inch padauk. The first thing I did was to cut down the padauk on the table saw to fit the outside dimensions of each box. Then I moved the fence 1/2 inch away from the blade and made a series of shallow cuts around the outside of each lid. The result looked something like this. Then I reset my fence to match the depth of the previous cut, held each piece on end, and ran it through the saw again. This would leave me with a single piece lid that protruded into the box to hold it in place. The one mistake I made with these was not accounting for the curve of the blade, which left the lids a bit loose. To make up for this, I glued some thin strips of walnut to the area that needed to be built back up. Once everything was done, everything received a thorough sanding and 3 coats of shellac. And that's all there is to it. If you found this video helpful and want to stay up to date with my latest projects, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I've got a lot of exciting projects lined up for the next year and would love to have you along for the ride.